And you've all been advocating for a more respectful communications practices in your own work. What would you say is the most important reason why organizations should rethink the role of communications and storytelling at this time?
Because somebody told me recently, they said, there's a lot of emphasis on trust building, but we need to think about trust is one thing as a principle, but then respect is how you show me that you trust me. And so it is important that organizations go back and rethink how are they demonstrating this trust? How are they demonstrating respect by how they relate and how they communicate? What stories are they telling? Who's telling that story? And all of that, so that we avoid the misrepresentation, we avoid the singular narratives that have been going on for so long, that have only represented people based on, who's funding the narrative.
Apologies, I'm going to use a language that I don't particularly love, but when we talk about global north and global south, the reality in the sector is that much of the sort of storytelling, the fundraising, the communications, the media engagement is done and designed, or has been done and designed, in the global north. Whether the best practices are intended with that, there has to be an acceptance that there is bias within that space. It's impossible to get to a truly authentic level of storytelling unless we really start rethinking some of those practices.
Victor, what are your perspectives? Why should we rethink how we tell our stories, and why now?
So the world is in a constant state of flux. The social environment is changing, and we operate within the social environment. Hence, the need to constantly examine the efficacy of our communication channels, our communication practices, our communication approaches, or we stand the risk of disconnecting from audiences and becoming irrelevant in the long run. We try to use the example of Africa and what narratives has done to the continent of Africa, the people of Africa over time, right? In the long run, we have seen what negative, harmful stereotypical narratives have done to the continent of Africa.
Oh boy, I love that. I totally love that. I was like, I almost said amen to that. And I remembered I'm not in church. Chilande, do organizations have a moral imperative? And what is that moral imperative?
Absolutely. I mean, I'll stay in church of some sort. If we go back to the basic concept of Ubuntu that we all have, connect with, I am because you are, right? And you take away my choice, you take away my will, you take away my soul by misrepresenting me in your stories and in your photos. And you cannot do that because we are all interconnected. Communication is powerful. And we've continued to say something with that singular focus of pleasing a certain person because you want a certain action from them. You want money most of the time. And that has really, really dented how a certain society is seen, mostly those of us that they define as the global south. It has affected, therefore, our relationships. It has affected our geopolitics.
It's been covered very well. I mean, particularly for an operational organisation like CARE International, we have as one of our key kind of programme principles, do no harm. And as any humanitarian organisation across the sector, and I think that is something that until only recently or in the last few years, we've been thinking, well, what does that actually mean in terms of communications? We were becoming very concerned, for example, about how human rights issues, different countries were being portrayed and stereotyped, and particularly kind of in ways that were weaponizing a political agenda, and particularly by sort of far-right conservative, and we've seen, that rise of the kind of the populism and the far-right sort of narrative and agenda, which has become a lot more mainstream in some contexts. So, for example, you would see sort of, a group of refugees, which would be placed up on a poster, and this sort of language of the swarm is coming, was this sort of threatening kind of narrative that has been again, weaponized, I think, by some hard right conservative groups. And yet, when we look at some of our own materials, we're showing kind of similar imagery, but with a very different, message, or we're trying to convey a very different message. And so we started to ask questions around, well, how much are we actually feeding into, unintentionally feeding into a narrative which is incredibly harmful?
Are there any barriers that each of you has faced when trying to tell these stories more respectfully?
I can't neglect my own personal barrier. There has been a process for me of addressing and accepting my own bias as a white person sitting in the global north, and that's been a really important journey that I've needed to personally go on.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. Chilande, what has been your experience like?
In trying to move forward and trying to get their stories known, somebody the other day was saying, and it was interesting, I was speaking to my father, who tends to have quite some wisdom, and I was saying to him, I'm working with these colleagues, international colleagues, and they keep going on and on about how Africans, we are verbose, we explain and over-explain, you can't just say something in a short period. And he gave me some very interesting perspective, and he said, mom, he calls me his mom, we do you know why Africans do that? It's because ever since we were colonized, we've had to always be on our defense. We've always had to over-explain ourselves. So we are constantly having to come up with stories. So that's been our story that has been passed down over time. And so we are used to always speaking a lot. And that speaks to when I'm trying to explain to folks, I know I also get frustrated when somebody goes on and on, but understand why and give them some grace. Right, and allow them to communicate in the way that they best know how to communicate. So that for me, those kinds of biases that come from cultural differences has been one of the biggest barriers that I face recently. If I'm to go personal.
Oh my God, Chilande. Victor and I were just nodding our heads,
right?
Because we can so relate to that. Absolutely.